Hi there, I'm Anmol and I welcome you to yet another episode of Git and GitHub tutorial. So just a quick recap. In the previous video, we learned about what is Git and what is GitHub. What are the features of GitHub? We saw that how do we actually make an existing repository, turn a local subdirectory into Git repository, and start tracking of all the changes. We learned about different stages of the file: untracked, unmodified, modified, and staged. We learned about a lot of, you can say, commands, and how do we actually integrate our current project with Git repository using command line that can be used in all the projects not specific to UiPath or not specific to RPA, as well as we also learned how we can integrate it or turn our local project into a Git repository using UiPath, the Teams option available in UiPath. Now, in this particular video, we would be covering how do we clone an existing repository. So a code that is already existing on a Git repository, if we want to get a clone of it and start working on it, start collaborating with our fellow team members, how do we do that? In the previous episode, we saw a way of pushing everything to the Git using HTTPS. Whereas in this episode, we would be seeing how do we do all of that using SSH, which is Secure Protocol. Okay, so this is what all we would be covering today, as well as we would be going towards this pictorial stuff, understanding what all this term actually means. So we'll understand the terminologies: pull, fetch, clone. We learned what is commit. We saw the add command in the previous video. We learned about the push command, and in this particular video, we would be learning about the fetch command, the pull command, and the clone command. So let's get started with the video. So first and foremost, we're going to clone an existing Git repository. So here is a demo Git repository that is existing. So this Git repository can even be a repository that is of your team and you want to start collaborating in it, or you've just onboarded onto this particular project and you want to start working. So you want to get a latest of it or a copy of this particular repository. So we'll again go with the same thing, that we'll see it, how do we do it using command prompt, so that anybody and everybody can do it and it would not be specific to UiPath or RPA, whereas we would also see a UiPath specific method. Okay, so first of all, we'll decide where do we actually want to get this particular directory. Okay, so suppose here we want to get this particular directory, or inside beginner, we want to get this particular repository. So we'll just copy the path. We'll go and change our directory to this particular thing. So now we are residing in this particular directory, that is the beginner directory. And here is where we want to clone it. Here is where we want to clone it or get the copy of that particular branch. Okay, so we'll see how do we actually do that. So Git clone is itself a command that we would be using when we are actually doing this particular thing, which means we would get a copy of that particular repository. So we'll type git clone. Okay, and now if you go back here and if you go to repositories, okay, so this is actually the URL of this particular repository, which is HTTPS, because we would be using HTTPS protocol for it, github.com/libgit2, which is the name of the repository. Okay, so we'll copy this particular thing, come back to a command prompt, and we'll paste this particular path. Now, what this particular command would do is, when we type git clone URL, so we'll pass the URL of the Git repository that we want to clone. And this particular thing will actually create a directory named libgit2. And it would also initialize a .git directory inside it. The same thing when we type git init. Okay, and it would pull down all the data for that repository and actually would check out a working copy of the latest version. Okay, so then if we go into libgit2 directory that we just create when we will execute this command, we'll see all the project files present in there. Okay, now if we go back here, we go back to this particular thing. Okay, and this is libgit2. If we go here, you can see these are all the files that are present in libgit2. If you go to code, you can either clone it using HTTPS, you can either clone it using SSH, or you can clone it to GitHub CLI. When you clone it using SSH, you'll see it says you don't have any public SSH key in your GitHub account. Okay. So we'll see how do we actually get it and how do we actually do it using SSH. Okay. Now let us go and simply click enter. Okay. So it says cloning into libgit2, remote not found, fatal, repository, this not found. Okay. So it has actually failed. So why is that it has failed is because we'll type lib. Okay, it still says that it has failed. So let's go and check that why it is actually failing. Okay, so because we're not passing the correct URL, let's go again and try cloning it. So we'll type git clone, and this time we'll pass the URL. Okay, so now it is actually cloning into libgit2, and you'll see a folder being created here with the name libgit2, and it will copy all the files, and you can see it has created a .git folder inside it. Okay, let's go back and see it is still, receiving the objects. So let's just wait for it to complete, and then we would be able to see all the files and folders that are present. So 43% complete. Let us wait. 56% complete. Once it is completed, you will see all the folders and files that are related to this particular thing there inside that particular libgit folder that is being created. Okay. Let's just wait. Okay. Meanwhile, it is actually, kind of working. The other thing that I would want to tell you now, when you do this git clone HTTPS libgit2, so it would create a directory named libgit2 only. But if you want to name it something else apart from libgit2, so you can give an extra argument. So you'll give the HTTPS stuff, you'll give space, and you'll give a name to it. When you give a name to it, then that directory would be created by the name that you have given it. So you can see everything is present here. Okay. So what I was saying is, if you want it to be created by some other name, okay, so say you want it with the name mygit, and if you do it, so another folder would be created here by the name mygit. So if you do not want the same name, so you can give it as a separate argument and you'll get that thing. Okay. So this is how you actually clone it. Now, going back, so this is how you actually clone it when you want to clone it using the command prompt. But what if you want to clone it using the UiPath? Okay, so you'll go to clone repository. So one very simple option is you can clone it using HTTPS. You'll have to pass the same URL here, and you have to pass a checkout, empty checkout directory here. Okay, so that is very simple. We even saw it in the previous video. So what you can do, you can go here, you can copy this particular URL, HTTPS. Okay, you will paste it here, and over here you will give an empty directory wherein your project would be checked out, wherein you will get all the files and folders of libgit2. Okay, and inside use credentials, I am already signed it with Anmol Yadav. You can either pass your user ID and password of GitHub here, or you can simply sign in with GitHub. It will open a window, authentication window, and you can simply sign in and get everything downloaded. The other way is you can do it using SSH. Now, when you go on doing it with SSH, what does it say? It says private key path and a password is required. Okay, so you actually need to create a private key for your local, and you'll pass the path of that private key here. Now, how do you actually go on creating the private key path? So here is the command. You can just simply type generate a new SSH key and you can get this command here. Okay, so I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it here. Okay. And here I'm going to pass my email ID. So I'll say, okay. So now it says enter the file in which you want to save the key. So default file path name would be here, but if you want to save it to some other location, you can even pass that. If I press enter, it would be saved into this default location, C users user.ssh. So I'll press enter. Okay. For me, the file is already existing. If I want to overwrite, I'll type Y. Enter passphrase. If you do not want to pass any password, you can simply press enter. Same passphrase again, press enter. So your ID has been generated. Okay. Now I'll just simply navigate to this particular location. Okay. Let's navigate to this particular location. C users SSH. So I'll go to C users user SSH, and this is my password. Okay. So I'll try to open this particular thing into Notepad. So open with Notepad. So this is my key. Okay, so I'll copy this particular key. I'll go back to my GitHub account. I'll go to my accounts and I'll go to settings. And over here, you can see SSH and GPG key. I'll go to SSH and GPG key. I'll add a new SSH key. You'll paste your SSH key here. You can name it something. I'll name it Anmol and I'll add my SSH key. It will ask me to confirm my password. I'll confirm my password. Now I've created an SSH key. If I go back here, I have passed my remote repository. Okay, let's try to get a uipath folder only, a uipath repository only. So I'll go to repositories. I'll go to this uipath code. Okay, I'll copy the SSH stuff, which is this one. I'll go back here. I'll pass my repository URL. Okay, now I also want a empty directory. So I'll create an empty directory here, which is this one. I'll say SSH. Okay, so this is where my entire code would be pulled. So I'll go back here. I'll pass my remote repository, which is this. It is asking me for my private key path, which is this particular thing. So I'll pass it. Okay. And password, because my passphrase was nothing. So I'm going to go with nothing and I'll click on open. Okay. So it is saying checking out from that particular directory and it is creating the workspace. And here you have got that thing. Integration exercise was the one that I pushed in the last video. And now I've pulled everything from the GitHub using SSH protocol for me to start working on it. Okay, so this is how easy it is to clone your repositories, to clone an existing repository into your local workspace. You can do it either using command prompt or you can do it using HTTPS or SSH. Now, coming back to the last thing that we see here, what do we mean by clone? What do we mean by fetch? And what do we mean by push? And what is the difference between all of this? So you even sometimes they even ask you all this in interview. So hear me out very carefully. So when you say clone is you actually creating a working copy of it onto your local for you to work on. Okay, and if you do any changes, then you add it and you commit it. Okay, so if you commit it, you're actually committing to your local repository. So this is even the question that is being asked in the certification examination. When you commit it, you're committing to your local repository, and when you're pushing it, you're pushing it to your remote repository. Okay, so that is the difference between commit and push. Now, when you say you are fetching it, okay, so fetching is what you do when you want to see what everyone else is working on. Okay. And it does not force you to actually merge the changes into your repository. So when you're fetching it, you will get everything from your remote repository to your local repository. It will not come to your local workspace. The changes will not be merged unless you explicitly merge it. Okay, so this way, fetching is a safe way to review commit before you are integrating it with your workspace. So if you actually want to get everything and see what all changes has been done, what all commit has been done, so everything would be fetched from the remote repository, but would still reside onto your local repository. Whereas when you do pull, everything will come into your local workspace where you're working. Okay, so that is the difference between pull and fetch. And we already have seen push means that you'll push everything from your local repository to the GitHub repository, which means onto the cloud storage, which means now it is safe and you can access it from anywhere and anybody in your team can also access it. Whereas when you're doing commit, you're definitely tracking the changes, but you're tracking it onto your local repository. The time you push it, everything goes onto your remote repository, which is your Git repository. So that's it for this particular Git and GitHub tutorial. We saw almost everything on how do we clone it, how do we clone it using different protocols, and how do we push it using different protocols, and how do we do it using command prompt, and then how do we do it using uipath. So I hope the video was helpful. And if you want me to make the similar video on using SVN and TFS, do let me know in the comment section below and I will make a video on it. So I'll see you in the next video. Till then, stay tuned and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.